We know that Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, for instance, is in many details fictional, but Paul Revere still existed, and he still rode. Perhaps the legend of Hezekiah Wyman was likewise fictionalized, but based on fact.
Good evening. Welcome to the first event in this year's Paul Revere Memorial Association Lowell Lecture Series. My name is Tegan Kehoe, and I'm the Research and Adult Program Director at the Paul Revere House. And as many of you know, this past April was the 250th anniversary of the event known as the Midnight Ride, in which Paul Revere and others shared the news that Royal soldiers were on the move, culminating in the Battle of Lexington and Concord the next day. The theme of this year's series is Whose Midnight Ride? And each lecture will have a different answer or set of answers to that question, looking at various participants in the ride or who claims the Midnight Ride today. Tonight, J.L. Bell will be kicking off this year's series with a talk on lost and legendary Midnight Riders. I'm excited because the theme, of course, touches on the Midnight Ride, which is near and dear to our collective hearts at the Paul Revere House. But also some other topics that are near and dear to us, history myths, and who gets a piece of the historical story based on what information. J.L. Bell is the author of The Road to Concord, How 4 Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, and the author of many articles about Massachusetts in the 1760s and 1770s. He maintains the blog Boston 1775, offering daily updates of history, analysis, and unabashed gossip about revolutionary New England. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming J.L. Bell.
Thank you. Thank you to Tegan and Nina from the Paul Revere House, to the GBH and Suffolk people who are here providing this for everybody, and to everybody who's come out. I'm going to talk about some of the lost riders of April 19th, and by lost I mean people beyond Paul Revere and the two men he mentioned, William Dawes and Dr. Samuel Prescott. Now, as David Hackett Fisher and his research team showed in Paul Revere's Ride, there were scores of people riding along the roads in the Massachusetts countryside that night, spreading the big news that the British, or the regulars, were out. The British soldiers were coming. And then the news of the actual fighting. And some of those people were express riders hired by the Patriots authorities or ordered by militia officers to spread the news. Others just jumped into the role spontaneously, and most of these people have never been identified. Now, there are also a few others whose names did get into the historical record, and one of my questions is, do they deserve to be in the historical record for that? In fact, one of the most famous riders that night has been lost for 2.5 centuries now, and I'm not going to be able to name him or her. As everyone here knows, on the evening of April 18th, Paul Revere arranged for a friend to hang 2 lanterns in the steeple of Christ Church, Boston's North End church, the North Church as it's called, the Old North Church as Longfellow called it. It was a signal to colleagues across the river in Charlestown. And Richard Devens of Charlestown later wrote, "I then sent off an express to inform Messrs. Gary and Messrs. Hancock and Adams at Lexington that the enemy were certainly coming out." But that rider never made it through. He was probably scared off by British Army officers guarding the roads, the same British officers whom Paul Revere spotted and had to evade on his ride when he came across the river later to be the backup messenger. He was the backup system, and it worked. Neither Devens nor Revere nor anyone else involved ever named that first rider who went out of Charlestown or left any clue about that person's identity. And I suspect it was a man who the British patrols had detained and held at gunpoint and all. They would have complained about that because men from Lexington did complain about just that. Patriots would have remembered, even celebrated him for having been detained and having braved the redcoats, but they didn't. Instead, there's complete silence about him. And that strikes me as most likely a result of people sort of disappointment, embarrassment. We gave him this job, it didn't work. We don't mention him anymore. But he is our first lost rider of the evening. We don't know who it was. We don't know what happened to him. And if Revere had not come out after him, then things would have been quite different. We do, however, have these four names of people who I'm going to talk about tonight because they are associated with riding on April 19th, 1775. I'm going to talk in more detail about how their stories surfaced and developed and what we might know about them today based on all the historical record. And looking at these stories, I hope, can show us more about the breadth of life during the Revolutionary War, and it can show us more about how we remember that history. Most people today have not heard the name of Hezekiah Wyman. But in the mid-1800s, he was the most famous American writer connected to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Before Longfellow wrote his poem in 1860, more Americans had probably heard the story of Hezekiah Wyman than the story of Paul Revere. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow even wrote a stanza in the first draft of Paul Revere's Ride that alluded to Wyman, or more specifically to Wyman's horse. The horse was also very famous and important. According to this story, Wyman was a white-haired farmer mounted on a white horse, galloping on the high ground above the British soldiers as they withdrew from Concord to Boston. And those soldiers could see the old man riding ahead of them, dismounting, aiming his long musket across the saddle and firing. And every time, the story goes, a British officer or soldier would fall. And the redcoats began to call this man Death on a Pale Horse. And we can still find that story of Hezekiah Wyman in some histories of April 19th. But where did it come from? What is the earliest source? For decades, the best clue we had to the first publication of the Wyman story was a reference to the Boston Pearl sometime before 1840. Not so long ago, finding the actual story with that information would have required either amazing luck or the hard work of locating and reading every issue of the Boston Pearl for a decade. That form of labor was usually called getting a graduate degree. Nowadays, digital archives make those sorts of searches much, much quicker. And with a few key clicks in the right places, Charles Bainey and I were able to pin down Wyman's print debut. It was the August 22nd, 1835 issue of the Boston Pearl and Literary Gazette. The story was credited simply to a soldier of the Revolution, and the text said nothing about its sources. Thus, the White Horseman, Hezekiah Wyman, first appeared in a literary magazine alongside a love tale, poetry, essays, literary criticism. The tale starts with British soldiers marching towards Lexington, and a few miles away, girls assisted their brothers in putting on their equipments, and the old men saddled his horses for his sons. And in rides a local militia officer, Captain Rowe, under 30 years of age, of middling stature and dark eyes, which now gleamed with fire. At his entrance, one young and blooming lass hung her head and sighed deeply as he set off for the fight. The White Horseman then shows that captain in command of the company at Lexington Common when the redcoats start shooting. And half the Lexington men are killed, including Captain Rowe. And then our real hero, the White Horseman, enters the scene. There was an old man by the name of Hezekiah Wyman, the window of whose house overlooked the ground where those murders were committed. And no sooner did he see his brave countrymen fall than he inwardly devoted himself to revenge the unhallowed slaughter. Wife, he said, is there not an old gun barrel somewhere in the garret? I believe there was, said she, but pray, what do you want with it? I should like to see if it's fit for service, replied he. If I am not mistaken, it's good enough to drill a hole through a regular. Mercy on me, husband, are you going mad, an old man like you, 60 years last November, to talk of going to war? The old man made no reply, but ascended the stairs and soon returned with a rusty gun barrel in his hands. In spite of his wife's incessant din, he went to his shop, made a stock for it, and put it in complete order for use. He then saddled a strong white horse and mounted him. He gave the steed the rein and directed his course toward Concord. Hezekiah Wyman starts shooting back and dashed so closely upon the flank of the enemy that his horse's neck was drenched with the spouting blood of the wounded soldiers. And soon the regulars gave him the name of Death on a Pale Horse. Obviously, we're in the realm of myth here. Wyman sees his neighbor killed, makes his own weapon, and turns out to be an expert marksman. And many of you probably remember that the American captain on Lexington Common that morning was named John Parker, and he didn't die there. No young man named Roe was killed in Lexington, or wounded, or as far as you know, standing on that common. And other details of the White Horseman don't match the historical record either. And in 1835, it wasn't hard to find firsthand descriptions of the Lexington skirmish. The Boston Pearl wasn't even trying to be accurate. Whoever was writing this, he or she was writing in a genre called the historical legend. The legend is a sort of lost genre in American literature. Washington Irving launched the form with such tales as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820. And for me, the genre's main ingredients include a historical setting, often studded with what seem to be authentic though untraceable historical details, a spooky atmosphere, whether or not the events are actually supernatural, and a tone of inevitable moral judgment. And other examples include Nathaniel Hawthorne's Legends of the Province House, Robert Montgomery Byrd's The Legend of Mary the Miner, and probably the highest achievement within the genre is Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter. The authors of legends and most of their original readers probably understood these stories to be fiction. When those authors remained famous, like Irving and Hawthorne, readers continued to recognize those tales as fictional. But when an author was anonymous or forgotten, or the work was easily reprinted outside of its original context, readers started to take those legends to be fact. For example, George Lippard wrote an anecdote about the Liberty Bell being rung to signal independence in a book called Washington and His Generals, or Legends of the Revolution. That story eventually got into the history books. A Boston lawyer named William Austin published spooky stories about Peter Rugg, the missing man, starting in 1824. And a century later, Alexander Woollcott had to write an article explaining that those stories were not true. The White Horseman was another legend. It conveyed the dominant American understanding of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, that the Middlesex farmers were peaceful until roused by the invasion of bloodthirsty soldiers, at which point they became frightfully efficient warriors. That story boiled down that whole understanding into a single character. And the White Horseman was such an effective tale for its 1800s audiences that it kept getting reprinted. And those republications began to strip away the context. Some versions changed how Hezekiah Wyman's wife, she stopped saying, "Oh, you're 60 years old," and she started saying, "Oh, you're 80 years old." But the reprinting, the most important, the reprinting removed the story from the literary context and put it in with other Revolutionary War stories, sometimes labeled as a reminiscence, as if it was based on fact. And after 1855, some reprints began to take out the obviously fictional Captain Roe and put in the name of John Parker. And all those changes made the White Horseman appear more authentic, when it probably was never meant to be taken that way by the original author. In 1936, Henry Smith Chapman included Hezekiah Wyman in his History of Winchester. And this was a fairly standard local history describing the heroic contributions of local men to major events in American history. But Chapman added something new. Chapman quoted documentation that there really was a Hezekiah Wyman in Middlesex County on April 19, 1775, and he really did own a white horse. Hezekiah Wyman lived in the part of Woburn that is now Winchester, not in Lexington within sight of the Common, as the story had it, but within reach of the Lexington alarm. He was 54 years old, not 60, but old enough that he might have had white hair. And a generous researcher from Woburn named Chris Hurley gave me this image of Wyman's will from 1779, and it shows that he left his white mare and his gun to his son Daniel. So this evidence opens the possibility that the White Horseman was an exaggerated version of a real event. We know that Longfellow's poem, Paul Revere's Ride, for instance, is in many details fictional, but Paul Revere still existed, and he still rode. Perhaps the legend of Hezekiah Wyman was likewise fictionalized, but based on fact. In the end, however, I think that scenario is unlikely. The actions of Revere and Prescott and Dawes are confirmed in documents from 1775 and shortly afterwards. In contrast, Hezekiah Wyman's name does not show up on the names of on the lists of Woburn militiamen who turned out for the Lexington Alarm. And there's a simple explanation for how researchers eventually found the name Hezekiah Wyman somewhere in Middlesex County. A family named Wyman had settled in Woburn in the early 1600s, and they had a lot of male descendants. So by the late 1700s, you couldn't throw a pebble in parts of Middlesex County without hitting a Wyman. Here is the Francis Wyman House in Burlington, for instance. Furthermore, the name Hezekiah, it was fairly common in the 18th century. In a study of naming patterns in Massachusetts in 1771, Daniel Scott Smith found that Hezekiah was the 62nd most common male name in his sample. And that compares with the name Samuel for male babies born in 1950. So it wasn't uncommon at all. We would not be surprised to meet somebody named Hezekiah. But Hezekiah lost popularity in the early 1800s. Thus, an author in 1835 who wanted to come up with a believable, old-fashioned name for a Massachusetts Revolutionary hero could easily land on Hezekiah Wyman because there were Hezekiah Wymans. And if you're looking for a 60-year-old man from Lexington, but you're willing to settle for a 54-year-old man from Winchester, then you've got a match. It's also important to note that the power of the White Horseman as a story comes from how it describes the fear of the British soldiers each time they spot a white-haired farmer. "Ha!" cried the soldiers, "there comes that old fellow again on the white horse. Look out for yourselves, for one of us has got to die." But no British accounts, authentic British accounts of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, talk about soldiers fearing a man shooting from a white horse. There's a single statement from about mounted provincials from Lieutenant Frederick Mackenzie of the 23rd Regiment. "Numbers of the rebels were mounted, and when they fastened their horses at some little distance from the road, they crept down near enough to have a shot. And as soon as the column had passed, they mounted again and rode round until they got ahead of the column and found some convenient place from whence they might fire again." Mackenzie did not describe those men firing with their guns laid across their saddles the way Hezekiah Wyman supposedly did. He did not describe anyone with white hair and a white horse and very, very good aim. The tale of an old marksman named Hezekiah Wyman striking fear into the redcoats reflected what Americans wished the British soldiers had felt, what they wished the British soldiers had said. It's how the next generation liked to imagine that battle, but the story of the White Horseman has to remain in the category of legends. My next two lost riders tonight are Abigail Smith and Abel Benson, and they were said to be part of the network that spread the alarm in 1775, summoning militiamen to oppose the British forces. And specifically, they were both linked to the alarm in the Neck, an area of what is now Natick, but which in 1775 belonged to Needham. What's most interesting is that both Abigail Smith and Abel Benson were children, which might make their stories especially appealing to certain audiences. In contrast to Hezekiah Wyman, they get mentioned first in government documents and local histories, not a literary magazine. So are they more trustworthy? Little Abigail Smith of Dedham grew up to become the widow Abigail Stafford of New Jersey. And as early as 1838, Abigail Stafford applied to Congress for a pension as the widow of a Continental Navy veteran. And in 1854, a congressional committee decided that her father, her grandfather, her uncles had all contributed to the war, particularly to the Battle of Lexington, and that she had furnished clothing for the army, and she was very old. So the next year, Congress passed a special law for Abigail Stafford, granting her federal money. And she died 6 years later in 1861. 5 months after that, on January 6, 1862, her daughter Sarah Smith Stafford presented a memoir of Mrs. Abigail Stafford and her times to the New Jersey Historical Society. And this memoir starts out repeating the statements about Abigail Stafford's father and grandfather from her pension records, but it also describes how Abigail herself, at about 10 years of age, experienced the Lexington Alarm. Quote, "An eccentric man named Daniel Bacon of Reverend Mr. West's congregation, returning from Boston, rode in great haste to her grandfather's house at Dedham and said, "Cousin Ephraim, the redcoats are coming, and you must try to head them." The alarm became general, and all actively engaged in preparing to defend their country from tyranny. Young Abigail Smith was among that number. It being necessary to send a message at night, she put on a man's hat, and soon she was on her way to Sawin's Mills to give information to her cousin Thomas Sawin, the ensign of one of the companies, that the redcoats were coming. From thence she rode with speed to the residence of Captain Aaron Smith near Needham. When she arrived there, as it was still in the night, they thought the girl was lost. Yet they believed her story, and soon was Captain Aaron Smith and his sons with their fleetest horses alarming the families along the Needham road to Boston. This reads like the sort of story that a mother or grandmother would tell their children. And indeed, the memoir goes on to describe Abigail Stafford's recollections of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. They saw the British soldiers with their nodding plumes and bright armor glittering in the sun, and Mrs. Stafford was wont to give the most vivid description of the scene, how our horsemen would cross the fields and fire upon them as they retreated toward Boston. She would often remark, they played Yankee Doodle out to Lexington in derision, but we made them dance to that tune into Boston. And saying, Indian pudding and pumpkin pie, we did make the redcoats fly. This is obviously family lore. We can easily picture Abigail Stafford teaching those stories and rhymes to her daughter and other children. Now, as a historical source, family lore has good points and bad points. On the plus side, it can preserve the experiences of ordinary people caught up in events. And it's especially useful in preserving the experiences of women and children who don't usually get into the public accounts. But on the downside, family lore tends to make your own ancestors out to be central to the story, and your family's story, therefore, vital to the nation. I think older relatives can tell these sorts of stories to their children, massaging the truth for the sake of entertainment or education or moral improvement, and never expect those stories to be repeated outside the family. But most of us grow up believing our family lore, even if we don't remember every detail accurately. And sometimes we grown children tell those stories to the world because we think that they're important. After all, we grow up thinking that they were important. And that's how we have, for instance, the tale of Betsy Ross sewing the first American flag. The Stafford family lore is quite detailed. Furthermore, public records confirm some details, like that the men in the extended Bacon and Sawin families were officers on April 19, 1775. Lieutenant John Bacon was killed in the fighting at West Cambridge. The Stafford family lore was accepted by South Natick's local historian, Horace Mann, in a paper published in 1882. It was to Thomas Sawin's house that Abigail Bacon and her niece, Abigail Smith, came on the night of 18th of April, 1775, to warn the Sawins of the marching of the British from Boston. And this house was a rendezvous of a portion of Natick Minutemen. Abigail Bacon later married Thomas Sawin, and she lived for many years in Dedham. And that suggests that since a Natick historian was writing this, that some versions of the same anecdote about Abigail Smith and Abigail Bacon came down in two branches of the family. One branch that stayed in the Dedham area and one branch that moved to New Jersey. Now, those versions aren't completely independent because the families were still in touch with each other, but they seem, maybe they're confirmation. And some elements of Abigail Smith's story have the smell of real life. They preserve confusion and loose ends and not just bravery and moral lessons. The eccentric man who brings out the first warning, the way the Smiths first assume that Abigail is lost because she's out so late at night. Even the man's hat that she wears. There's also a bit of a hint of family dysfunction because Abigail is living with her maternal grandfather while her father Henry resided on the bank of the Charles River near Boston, so the family is split up. On the other hand, other details exaggerate the importance of the family. Stafford claimed that her mother alerted only two individuals, but she also said that Abigail's Aunt Betsy was crucial for alerting none other than John Parker, the captain in Lexington. Now, it also turns out that the Stafford family left us with some reasons for doubting their lore. They claimed to own a flag that Abigail's husband had saved from Captain John Paul Jones's Bonhomme Richard. That flag came with a letter from the Continental Congress's Marine Committee as proof of its authenticity. The family arranged for their flag and the letter to be widely displayed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, including at Lexington's big centenary celebration in 1875. And it was eventually donated to the Smithsonian. Then people noticed that the letter from the Marine Committee was dated 5 years after the Continental Congress had dissolved that committee. And the flag was pulled from view, judged to be a deliberate hoax. And let's go back to Abigail Stanford's application for a widow's pension in 1838, which a reader named John Russell sent me a few years back. As part of that application, she signed the document saying that she was born in the year 1775. That fits well with the age of her parents. It doesn't fit well with any story of her riding a horse in 1775. So Abigail Smith's story may include authentic details about April 19th, possibly that she learned from her relatives as she grew up, and then passed on to her daughter, but she was not involved. She was not a real rider on April 19th. Next, we move on to Abel Benson. Abel Benson's connection to the Lexington alarm starts in a genealogy of the Bacon family published in 1908. Same Bacon family. The genealogist quoted a man named Austin Bacon describing how he understood his grandfather, Lieutenant John Bacon of Needham, how that man responded to the Lexington alarm. In the night or near morning, the alarm was given, and he set off on horseback to join his company at the more eastern part of the town, and sent his horse back when they got nearly to the lower falls. Soon after he had gone, a trumpet sounded, and some Framingham men came along with one Nero Benson, a Negro for trumpeter, and every house they passed had a blast. It's not clear how Austin Bacon learned this about the African-American trumpeter among the Framingham men, since his own ancestor had already gone to the other part of town. So maybe some other relatives told him, or there might have been local lore. That lore also surfaced in George Coon Clark's History of Needham, Massachusetts, published in 1911. Clark was a longtime collector of local history, old enough to have met a woman who had lived through the first year of the Revolutionary War, and he was writing in 1911. And here's how Clark described the alarm in Needham. On the morning of April 19th, 1775, the news that the British were on their way to Concord was brought to Bullard's Tavern, and the alarm was given by Ephraim Bullard, the tavern keeper, or by his son of the same name, who fired a gun on Bullard's Hill. In the Leg, that little part of the town, the alarm was sounded by the trumpet of Abel or Nero Benson, a Negro. Unfortunately, Clark didn't identify his sources either, but we do have these two sources from neighboring towns about a black trumpeter who might have been Abel or might have been Nero. And we can find a little bit more about Abel and Nero Benson in William Barry's book, The History of Framingham, published in 1847. And in fact, that's where I think these two authors, Bacon and Clark, found some of their information. 3 times in that book, Barry identifies Nero Benson as the trumpeter in Captain Clark's company from Framingham in 1725, 50 years earlier. It was an earlier war. And another page in that book lists Abel Benson, trumpeter, among the town's Revolutionary veterans. And elsewhere, Barry states that Abel Benson was born in 1766. So, in fact, Nero Benson was Abel Benson's grandfather. Both these men are identified in this one book as trumpeters from Framingham, which leaves us with this odd situation. The Needham trumpeter was either Nero, who was about 70 years old, or Abel, who was only 8. And it's hard to believe that people who saw that trumpeter couldn't tell the difference. So what I think happened was that Bacon and Clark both heard a local tradition that a black trumpeter had spread the alarm in the Needham Leg on April 19th, and they looked in the books for any mention of black trumpeters, and they found references to Nero Benson and to Abel Benson in the Framingham history, so they included one or both of those names as they described the alarm. So they were doing their best to use lore and historic sources and come up with all the information they could. In 2003, Professor Michael Sokolow published a biography of a descendant of Nero and Abel Benson, which offered more details about the family. And most important for the question of who trumpeted the alarm in the Needham leg, Sokolow states that Nero Benson died in Sudbury in 1757, which was, of course, 18 years before the Lexington alarm. So we can be pretty clear that Austin Bacon's identification of the trumpeter as Nero Benson could not be correct. If we eliminate Nero Benson as a possibility, does that mean the trumpeter in 1775 was Abel Benson? I don't think so, and this is why. We know Abel Benson was a soldier in the Revolutionary War because we have documents from his enlistment in early 1781, when he was 14. He claimed to be 16 to be eligible. His military records even offer a description of him: 5 foot 2 inches, complexion yellow, hair black, eyes black. Abel's father, William, was the son of Nero and Dido Benson, both Africans kidnapped from Africa, but Abel's mother was a woman of British descent, originally named Sarah Perry. As a bounty for enlisting in the Continental Army, the town of Framingham gave Abel Benson land. This made him one of the few landowners of African ancestry in the young state of Massachusetts, and he was thus able to offer a home and some support to members of his extended family. Abel Benson lived until 1838, long enough to apply for a pension from the federal government. That process required applicants to testify about how they had served in the Revolutionary War, when they enlisted, what battles they were in, who were their commanding officers, any anecdotes that could help to confirm their claim. Abel Benson filed an application in April 1818, and for a while he received a pension of $8 each month. Then in 1820, the government cut him off because of that land he owned. He was too rich to deserve a pension. In 1823, under new rules, he reapplied. It took 6 years, but the federal government started paying the pension again. Abel Benson died at midnight on the 15th of September, 1838, and on the 2nd of October, his widow, Rhoda, applied to the government to continue the pension for her as a widow. Rhoda Benson started to receive $80 per year in March 1843. And that meant there were 3 times, 1818, 1823, and 1838, when Abel or Rhoda Benson went to the government and laid out his military services. How long Abel served was significant because that affected his eligibility for money. The Bensons had a reason to note every time he had helped to fight the war, but in none of those filings did the couple ever mention the Lexington alarm. They always dated his military service from 1781. There's no evidence that the Benson family preserved stories about him blowing the trumpet for the militia in April 1775. The first person to attach Abel Benson's name to the Lexington alarm was George Coon Clark, the local historian, and that was alongside the name of his dead grandfather. And as I say, I think he found that name in a book and thought that it was the best guess. But I suspect there were others out there who inherited Nero Benson's trumpet if he brought it home from the fighting in 1725, who taught Abel to play the trumpet and other instruments after Nero died in 1757, because Abel wasn't born yet. Perhaps Nero's son, William, learned the trumpet from his father and passed on that knowledge to his son. He seems like a good candidate, in fact, for being the trumpeter in 1775. He was born in 1732. By 1762, he had married Sarah Perry of Sudbury, a white girl in her mid-teens, and they were living in Shrewsbury. Sarah bore their first child in April 1763. Also in 1762, William Benson was sold to a white man named Joseph Collins, but 2 years later, Collins and 2 helpers tried to forcibly grab Benson and resell him, but a Middlesex County jury indicted Collins for false imprisonment. Somehow in those years, William Benson had become free in the eyes of the law, and he was able to take his former owner to court, and the court case ended with Collins formally acknowledging Benson's freedom. We might have another glimpse of William Benson in the year 1770. At that time, some people in the town of Marlborough were feuding with a local bigwig named Henry Barnes. and he was defying the Boston Whigs' boycott on goods from Britain. But he also employed a bunch of men at his potash factory in Marlborough, so he had guys on his side as well. And on one evening in July, locals gathered to attack Barnes's house and his employee base. And according to a letter published in the Boston Gazette in April 1770, the drum beating very briskly, and the mob, alias Sons of Liberty, collecting together, about 40 of the said mob being met at said woods with their weapons of death, waiting for orders. But it seems one William Benson, a Negro, who was pitched upon for their leader and herald, being a fellow of more sense than the rest of them, did not come among them. And the said mob, alias Sons of Liberty, knowing their cause to be bad, and their best man not coming, they dare not move forward in a body. That account describes William Benson as a leader and herald of the crowd. It's rare to see people identified as heralds. And what is the emblem of a herald? It's a trumpet. This incident makes it more plausible that militiamen in Framingham 5 years later might turn out at the sound of William Benson's trumpet. However, unlike his son Abel, the Massachusetts government has no record of William Benson actually doing military service during the war, even on April 19th. Furthermore, the historical record shows a black man named William Benson in conflict with the Patriot authorities in 1775 and 1776. In October 1775, William Benson, Negro, about 5'6" high, was in the jail at Cambridge, and he broke out. Unfortunately, this advertisement from the jailer doesn't say why William Benson was in the jail. Shortly before then, General George Washington had ordered that any Negro found straggling after the tattoo beating about the camp or any of the roads or villages near the encampments at Roxbury or Cambridge to be seized and confined, i.e. he wanted black men to be locked up if they were around the army camp without having business there. Was that related? Was that something William Benson was doing? We don't know. He may have been in jail for a civil offense. He may have been because there was a lawsuit or a debt. We just don't know yet. And I'm not even certain that there was only one William Benson in eastern Massachusetts at the time. On the other hand, this is a lead to follow up. And here's another one. This document comes from the sheriff of Worcester County, dated December 3rd, 1776, so more than a year later, after the siege of Boston, after the Continental Army has moved away, after Massachusetts is liberated. Jane Tolmie from the Clements Library in Michigan sent me this scan just this week. The Worcester sheriff reported that he had William Benson, a Negro man, in his jail, locked up for threatening Adam Walker as a person inimical and dangerous to the states of America. Adam Walker was a blacksmith in Worcester, and evidently this William Benson was accusing him of being disloyal, and either Walker had enough clout to have Benson locked up, or the Patriot authorities thought Benson was going too far and disrupting the peace. Everybody be friendly now. Adam Walker had in fact protested against the Patriot movement back in 1774, but then he had recanted. So now perhaps the local authorities didn't want people to go around accusing him. But then in 1778, 2 years later, the state banished Adam Walker for life as a loyalist. So ultimately, the government came around to agreeing with William Benson that he was inimical to the interests of the country. But in 1775 and then 1776, those authorities had Benson in jail. It would be really good to know more about William Benson because he sounds like a very interesting person. Assuming all these sources apply to the same man, here was someone who repeatedly pushing against the bounds of his society, marrying a white girl as a black man, resisting enslavement in the courts, breaking out of jail, accusing richer men of disloyalty. He was perceived to be on the forefront of political protest in 1770, but he also went his own way. So, did William Benson ride with his trumpet on April 19, 1775? I think it's possible, but it's far from certain because there are so many other African-American men of military age in and around Framingham. That local historian Horace Mann wrote in the 1880s, during the last half of the 18th century, there were 50 families of African descent recorded in Natick alone. And not all those people came to the notice of the white men who wrote town histories. We aren't really certain that the trumpeter was named Benson at all. A picture book about little Abel Benson helping to rouse the militia on April 19th, that would have a lot of appeal. But I think the trumpeter in Needham was probably an adult and is still a lost writer. That writer wasn't Abel Benson. It might have been William Benson. Either way, William Benson really deserves more attention. Finally, I come to a April 19th writer whose name was recorded not just in historical accounts, not just in family lore, but actually in records made on April 19th. We finally have a contemporaneous primary source. This story starts with Joseph Palmer, a member of the rebel Massachusetts Provincial Congress and of its Committee of Safety, the executive power in the colony outside of Boston. On April 18th, Palmer was staying in Watertown with the family of his daughter-in-law. And the next morning, about 8 o'clock, he heard news from a man named Sanger and wrote this short note. To all whom it may concern, be it known that the regular troops have this morning killed 6 men near Lexington Town Meeting House. And about 2 hours later, Palmer wrote a longer letter. We don't have that original document anymore, but we have copies made on that day, including this one that is from the collection of the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum in Lexington. Palmer wrote, to all the friends of American liberty, be it known that this morning before break of day, a brigade consisting of about 1,000 or 1,200 men landed at Phipps Farm in Cambridge and marched to Lexington, where they found a company of our colony militia in arms, upon whom they fired without any provocation and killed 6 men and wounded 4 others. By an express from Boston, this moment we find another brigade are now upon their march from Boston, supposed to be about 1,000. Palmer addressed that letter to Colonel Foster of Brookfield, one of the delegates. And he concluded, pray let the delegates from this colony to Connecticut see this. They know J. Palmer, one of the Committee of Safety. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress had designated 3 members who lived in the southwestern part of the colony to be liaisons with the friendly government of Connecticut. And Palmer was telling them, Colonel Foster and the other 2, that when they received their letters to tell the Connecticut people that he could be trusted. This was not a false alarm. The copy of the letter also states, the bearer, Mr. Israel Bissell, is charged to alarm this country quite to Connecticut, and all persons are desired to furnish him with fresh horses as they may be needed. And the writing on this document continues after Joseph Palmer's name and the address. And most important, it says, a true copy. When the rider carrying this letter stopped to change horses or rest, people wanted to hear the news, the big news from Lexington and Concord. Local authorities copied the text of that letter for themselves, and then they sent off copies with other messengers to spread the news as widely as possible. So there's like a message tree. In Worcester, for example, the town clerk, Nathan Baldwin, made a copy and signed his name on the copy to ensure its accuracy. And in fact, this is a copy of a copy, because this copy was made by Daniel Tyler Jr. of Brooklyn, Connecticut, from the copy endorsed by Nathan Baldwin in Worcester. And Tyler copied Baldwin's name, although he got it wrong. He wrote it as Balding. And this pattern was repeated in town after town. There are other copies of Palmer's letter with 5, 6, 10 postscripts, as each person wrote at the bottom. Yes, this is an authentic copy of what I got. Palmer's letter provided the first news of the war to many people between Watertown and Philadelphia. It was printed in newspapers and handbills. It was eventually reprinted in London. The postscripts to that letter show us exactly where the news traveled and how quickly. Historians began to study copies of this document in the late 1800s and early 1900s after Paul Revere's ride had made the image of a man on a horseback riding through the countryside into a patriotic icon. Israel Bissell, the man on those copies, he became a hero of the colonial revival. He was the subject of this WPA mural in Connecticut. He's been the hero of picture books and posters and poems. A lot of the press about Israel Bissell tallied up the towns that listed his name on copies and pointed that he must have ridden farther than Paul Revere. Some writers even say he rode all the way to Philadelphia. But we know that that's not true because we have in that historic record, the name of the dispatch rider from New York City to New Brunswick, New Jersey, it was a Mr. Moorbach. Bissell's job, according to what Joseph Palmer wrote, was to carry the news quite to Connecticut. His destination was Hartford, where the Connecticut government was and where the Massachusetts delegates were. Historians looking for more details about this Israel Bissell, these are all the places mentioned on some copies of this letter. All the yellow triangles show where the copy went through. Historians went looking for more details about this Israel Bissell mentioned on those documents, and they found a man born in Connecticut in 1752. He came from East Windsor. Israel Bissell and his brother Justice joined a militia company from East Windsor in July 1776, but he then served in the army only 1 month. After the war, the Bissell family moved to Middlefield, Massachusetts. Israel bought farmland. He married a woman named Lucy Hancock in 1784. He fathered 4 children. He died in 1823 at age 71, and he was buried in Hinsdale, Massachusetts. And his gravestone says simply, in memory of Mr. Israel Bissell, who died October 24th, 1823, age 71 years. Doesn't say anything about military service. He never applied for a military pension. In 1967, the DAR added a bronze plaque to his grave describing him as an important post rider on April 19th. Or was he? We have to remember that this wasn't a copy it wasn't the letter that Joseph Palmer wrote. It is a true copy of a true copy of that letter, and those copies were written in haste at one stop along the route. And in that haste, it's only natural that errors crept into the original text as more and more copies were made. By the time the message reached New York, the document referred to Israel Bissell and T. Palmer instead of J, and later copies from New Jersey and Pennsylvania rendered the writer's name as Trail Bissell. And when the letter was reprinted in this broadside in Baltimore, the writer was called Trial Russell. So in the corner of our map of places linked to Israel Bissell, we should note a few outside New England that mention odd variations on that name. Plus, there are a couple of copies that call the post rider Mr. Isaac Bissell. One is in the archive of Springfield. Another was signed by Silas Dean, an official from Connecticut who lived in Wethersfield, just south of Hartford. And that brings me to the research that the Western Massachusetts historian Lyon G. Miles shared through the Berkshire Equal and other venues. Miles found that all the papers in the Massachusetts archives about the post rider who carried Palmer's message were signed by Isaac Bissell. He identified himself as from Suffield, Connecticut, near the Massachusetts border. In July 1775, the Provincial Congress approved his bill for 6 days of expenses while riding to Hartford. But it took until April 23rd, a full year after his ride, for the Massachusetts government to pay Isaac Bissell the £2, 1 shilling that he asked for. So let's go back to the map to find our riders. This is the route of Isaac Bissell. From Watertown to Hartford by way of Worcester and Springfield, accurate copies of the letter he carried were made in Springfield and in Hartford for Silas Dean. Meanwhile, at Worcester, someone made a copy of that important dispatch and sent it south with another rider or set of riders, their names unknown. And by the time that copy reached Norwich, Connecticut, the text had changed the name of the rider from Isaac Bissell to Israel Bissell. And Isaac was no longer around to say, oh no, you got that wrong. And the letter went down to New Haven, and it went along the coast, and it went to New York, and it went to Philadelphia, and it went to Baltimore, all the way. Aside from Mr. Moorbach, all those riders, their names have been lost, but also Isaac Bissell's name was lost. Isaac Bissell, after he did his job, he got his £2, 1 shilling, he did his £2, 1 shilling worth of work. He went home to Suffield, where he had been born, and he immediately enlisted in a Connecticut regiment, and he marched back to Boston to participate in the siege, and he was a sergeant under Colonel Erastus Wolcott until March 1776. And one of the last things he did before going back home at the end of the siege of Boston was to go to the Massachusetts government and say, you still owe me £2. And that's when he finally got paid. And later in July 1779, Isaac Bissell mustered to defend New Haven from the British. He worked as a blacksmith in Suffield. He died in 1822. His grave is near the town's Congregationalist church, and it doesn't have a bronze plaque on it. Maybe that's something we can change. The Israel Bissell, buried in Hinsdale, has gotten special attention from the DAR. His name has been celebrated in poetry and art and even sitcoms. But all that celebration is just because of a spelling error. Bissell is a completely legendary writer, and we really have to credit Isaac Bissell and make sure he is no longer a lost writer of April 19th. Thank you very much. Now, we have a microphone for people who want to ask questions, and I'm happy to answer questions about what I've talked about here or about any other things you have to, any other questions you have about April 19th, which is something I've done a lot of study on in various ways. And if I don't know something, I'll tell you or make it up.
I just want to ask if the Israel's headstone, is it still like no plaque?
Does Israel Bissell have a plaque? Israel Bissell has a plaque on his grave in Hinsdale, Massachusetts. I don't think Isaac Bissell has a plaque yet. Oh. He does, however, have a Wikipedia page, or at least a Wikipedia mention. So he is getting some more attention. And at some point, Suffield, Connecticut might decide to make him their hometown hero and do a big splash about what he did.
Thank you so much.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for coming here to Suffolk University. My question is, and clearly you seem to be very passionate about the trumpeter. Are you planning on doing more research into not the son, but the father, and more of his actions throughout the war?
Am I going to do more research on William Benson? I would love to do more research. I mean, what I first started, I gave a version for this talk for the Paul Revere House, I think 15 years ago. And this has been revised because over time I have found new material, and the name William Benson just keeps coming up. And as I said, most recently in the last week, I got this document from the Clements Library in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The librarian there I think what happened was that a researcher came across this document, was trying to figure out, look at the names. They Googled William Benson's name and found my website where I've written about some other things. And they thought, oh, okay, this is interesting. Let me share this with this guy. I'm this guy. And so if anybody else out there has a source for William Benson, I would love to add it to the very short pile of sources that we have. It may, for instance, be possible that there is more detail about why he was in jail those 2 times in Massachusetts legal records, which are sort of daunting. So yes, I will continue to be searching for that, and I will continue to welcome any other sources about him. He seems to be, unfortunately, the working poor are among the most difficult people to find in historical records because they move around a lot. They don't own a lot of real estate. They don't leave wills often, but they're not so poor that they're in the poorhouse records. So finding William Benson, who had a wife and children, and at least one of his children, actually his child Abel, became this Continental Army veteran and this landowner. His oldest daughter, Katie, married a man named Peter Salem, who is sometimes, he's a veteran of the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he is sometimes credited with killing Major John Pitcairn at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So in fact, this was a fairly active African-American family in the early Republic. Yes, I'd love to find more about him.
Sounds like a movie could be made on this family.
Mm-hmm. We actually have an Abel Benson descendant who is watching on the live stream this evening.
Okay. Well, because being an Abel Benson descendant means you're also a William Benson descendant and a Nero Benson descendant. So whatever happens, you get the credit.
Yeah.
You mentioned family dysfunction about Abigail. Was there any mentions of the reasons why she was living with her grandfather, or was it just briefly mentioned?
I mentioned the family dysfunction, the fact that Abigail Smith, according to her own daughter, was not living with her father. Her father was living separately from the family in 1775. Is there any more clue about that? Not really. And in fact, if I recall the source correctly, it's just glossed over. It's just a little detail. And it's not the sort of thing that, in fact, family lore tends to keep around unless it's the point of the story. And so, no, I'm afraid I don't have more detail about that. And as I say, unfortunately, the Stafford, by the time the lore gets to Abigail Stafford's daughter, somewhere between her and the daughter, it's gone into the realm of just complete fabrications.
Were the two Bissells related, as far as you know? Or
Were the two Bissells related, Isaac and Israel? As far as I know, they were not close. Well, they certainly were closely related. I cannot find a connection to them unless maybe maybe a genealogist can go way back into their history. But no, they were living in different parts of the colony, and they were not like first cousins or anything. And at the time, Isaac and Israel were both fairly common names, and Bissell was one of the names, like Wyman in Woburn, where there were a lot of families.
So, hi, I was just wondering if you've done any research into kind of trying to find evidence against Paul Revere, because I think that if I heard the stories of like Wyman, Smith, Bissell, or any of the lost like writers that you looked into for the first time and kind of just heard the tales, like I wouldn't necessarily like think that there's like that they're like fabricated, as well as like when I heard Paul Revere's tales, like I don't necessarily like, my first thought isn't that like there's a lot of like fiction around it. So have you like tried to find evidence like for Paul Revere's and like for him like specifically like if he's as like fictional as them?
Okay, basically you're asking can we trust the story we hear about Paul Revere more than the stories? Because I've been doing a lot of debunking here about all these stories. I had four names, and basically I'm saying none of them were the actual writers, although there were other writers connected with them. With Paul Revere, we're in a different case because he, immediately after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, wrote out an account of what he did. And then he revised that account. And then in 1798, a couple decades later, he wrote an even more detailed account for the head of the Massachusetts Historical Society. And those can be checked. Oh, and also, he saved everything. And then the head of the Historical Society saved everything. So we have these documentation. We have lots of documentation of his activity within the Massachusetts or the Boston Patriot movement from the 1760s through the war. So it is his story, as he told it, seems very solid. He's also, although he's telling his own story, he's in the center of it. He's not taking all the credit. Was the person who gave us the name of Mr. Dawes, who gave us the name of Dr. Prescott. So he is sharing some of that credit, and eventually he gets captured, and he talks all about that. So I think that he and he's of course been very carefully studied. So what he has to say seems quite reliable. What Henry Wadsworth Longfellow had to say is quite unreliable. And he literally set out to write a fictional version. He turned it into a legend. He put Revere on the other side of the river when the signals were fine. He's had Revere ride all the way to Concord. That, which has become more famous, is not a reliable story, but Revere's own account seems quite reliable. In this regard, there is a lovely story that the Dawes family, the William Dawes' descendants, told of when the British officers captured him and Revere, and Prescott stopped them on the road between Lexington and Concord in Lincoln. And they stop Revere, and Prescott rides off one way, and Dawes rides off the other way, and he's being pursued by one or two horsemen, and he rides up to a house and yells, "I've got two of them for you, boys." And the officers who are chasing him think, "Oh, this is an ambush," and they turn around and leave. It's a wonderful story. It's the story that's written by his descendants a century later. It's the sort of story that, your grandfather tells, and you'll all laugh, and you think that's real, and you put it in the history books. And that seems to. But I also found that story in a newspaper in May 1775. saying one of the alarm riders had this happen to him. Doesn't give a name to it. So if William Dawes made up that story, he made it up right away. And in fact, I think it seems to fit what we know about him, and he did get away. And so I'm willing to credit him with that. But that's the sort of thing where we are never going to be totally certain, but we can correlate different sources together and come up with something that seems reliable and authentic. So it's a very good question, and I don't think there's a definite answer for practically anything.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that just also makes me think of the family lore that you're talking about, made me think about Paul Revere's family lore. So there's these stories that come with this dog. And when Paul Revere writes down those official accounts, he doesn't include this petticoat and dog stories. These are apparently told, but he didn't really pretend they were true to grown-ups, but maybe to kids. So the story that you tell to your family, you might add in the humorous elements, you might add in the scandalous elements, you might add in the dog line right there with me that night. And you're like, that dog was not there. That dog is 10 years old, right?
Mhm.
So those kind of things that are part of the lore, the teller knows they're not true. And in some cases includes them, in some cases doesn't. So Paul Revere made up some stuff that he only told his family and never included in the written account. So we don't give credence to those things actually happening. We give Grandpa told that, sure, but did it happen? Even he is not trying to say that. But yeah.
Yeah, although there's a story that while Revere and two friends were going to the waterfront to get into the rowboat and go across the Charles, they needed cloth to muffle the oars. And one of these other men supposedly went to a house and called up to a female relative and asked, and she threw him down a petticoat, a garment, which they then used to muffle the oars. And again, this is something that comes up many, many years later. I think it's after the poem has made Revere famous. It's the sort of lovely detail that adds verisimilitude to an otherwise bald and unconvincing narrative, as Gilbert and Sullivan said. And yet, one of those guys had a female relative in that house. So it may have happened. It's one of these things where I think in telling this story in a history book, you can say, did this happen? Did this not? Here's the evidence. If you're dramatizing the story, if you're telling it in a movie or a comic book or something, you really have to, you're under pressure to say exactly what happened and to say whether this is true or not. And it's not that certain. And there is a fair amount of just glossing, putting frosting on the cake to make for a sweeter dessert when you're telling the story, especially to your grandchildren.
Hi. When you're talking about like family lore, I'm just thinking, like, is for a source, is that like diaries? Because like when I think of that, I think of like spoken stories that are like, obviously like told down. So like how do you find it as a source? So like you can research it and talk about it.
When I use the word lore, I really am talking about stuff which it's eventually written down, but it has this sort of vague provenance going back to where it was originally heard, where the person who is writing it down says, there is a tradition. This is something that I heard from my grandmother. This is something that we've passed down. And it doesn't come with documentation. It doesn't come with, I heard this story on this date. Because, when we're hearing Grandma tell a story of the family when we're 5 years old, we don't write down the date, and she isn't holding up documents and so on. And that's what counts as lore. And there's also, there's local lore. There's something that the National Park Service calls ranger lore, which is when you hear other people giving a tour so often that it becomes ingrained in you. And if you are actually asked what's the source of that, you think, oh, I don't know. So we all have lore. Lore is part of the human condition. And by that, I simply mean that it's not traceable. At some point it gets written down. And once it's written down, then it becomes, it's solid in a way. It's a source, and we can say, at this date, other people might be picking up on that and trying to fit their stories into it. As of this date, it's stuck, so it should not details should not continue to change, as sometimes stories do. So I sort of look upon that sort of oral history as worth the paper it's written on. That once it gets written down, then it becomes useful for more. And the only way to get lore before it's written down is to be the one who writes it down, to be the one who goes and interviews older people or your relatives, and gets that story, knowing that memories might change. We massage stories to make them make sense, to be more entertaining, but that produces a historical source that generations from now people will be able to use. Okay, well, thank you all very much.